Remember, this program continues until this afternoon, at least until 6:30, okay, when we will finish with the panel after this presentation that's coming now. And tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. That's Chile time, with Ricardo Morales coming from Mexico, okay? Antonella Sorace, who's Italian and who's coming from the UK, and Katiuska Estrada from Chile, all right? So remember, make plans to stay with us also, and to be with us tomorrow morning. All right, now I would like to take a few minutes to introduce you to our next speaker. He comes all the way from Brazil. His name is André Hedlund. And he is an EFL teacher with 15 plus years of experience in schools and universities. He holds a BA in international relations and an MSc in psychology of education from the University of Bristol, England, as a Chevening scholar. He has worked as an academic consultant and teacher trainer for Nat Geo plus TED Talks. He advocates for the online education training platform, International Education and Resource Network, I-EARN, and he's the current president of Partners of the Americas in Goiás, a Michigan certificates examiner, a member of Brad Diesel's Mind, Brain, and Education, SIG. He's a senior mentor for the Edify bilingual program. He has been a speaker in conferences in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Portugal, the UK, Poland, Spain, Romania, Montenegro, Slovakia, and Hungary. His dream is to change education worldwide through the concepts of mind, brain, and education. So, André, we welcome you to the stage. I hope you're somewhere there. Yes, he's there.
I'm here.
So we're glad to have you with us today, and the platform is all yours.
Thank you so much, Joaquin, for this warm welcome. I'm really honored, really privileged to be here today, especially because I know how important this conference is. And I've been working with bilingual education for a while now. So I really hope that I can make my contribution. And I think Joaquin got my bio from my website. So if anybody's interested in the work that I do, please go to edcrocks.com. You can find my contact details there. And I would be glad to connect with all of you. I'm sure there are some Brazilians here. You know, I think I saw some familiar names. And I know that you're here because you're also interested in bilingual education. So I can see Raquel is here. Wonderful. So let me start sharing my slides with you. And of course, you can use the chat box to write your comments, to ask questions. We will have a couple of minutes at the end for me to try to address a couple of issues that might arise here. But today, really, we're going to talk about PBL, project-based learning, CLIL, content and language integrated learning, and bilingual education. But the question is, what about the book, right? I know that some speakers have addressed how you can use the materials, how you can think about your context, your scenario, but I'm going to challenge a couple of things today, hopefully in a positive way, for you to think about the Brazilian scenario nowadays, how we can actually look beyond what we have and what we have to do to achieve a certain status quo that we normally only see in smaller countries in Europe. So let's get started. So the agenda really is bilingual education scenario in Brazil. So what is it that makes us unique in a way? What about PBL and CLIL? So I'm not going to address what they mean necessarily, the description, because I'm sure you've seen this before, but why we chose PBL and CLIL to be the approaches and methods that we use in bilingual education. Then we're going to talk about the book. So what's the place of the book today? Especially with the pandemic now. I'm sure many of you have been wondering and asking yourselves, so how can we use the physical book in the classroom if everybody's actually at home nowadays, or maybe you're having concurrent classes, right? Some people are in the classroom physically, some are at home. And then I'm going to share two cases, lessons learned. We're still learning, we're always learning. I think we are embracing the concept of lifelong learning as a matter of fact. And hopefully you can share some of your lessons as well so that we can learn together. And then the concluding remarks. So first of all, what is the current scenario in Brazil? So I challenge you to help me here. What do you think? What comes to mind when you think about language teaching in Brazil? I know that many of you are not from Brazil. I know many of you are from South America. Some of you are from the UK. Some are from other parts of Europe. So I want you to use the chat box and let me know what you think. Do you think we are doing okay in language teaching here in Brazil? Or do you think we need to get better, way better? Or what's your impression? So let's see. I'm looking at the chat box now. Don't be shy, everyone. I'm really counting on you. Oh, I think the chat box is not really, yes, so I'm getting some direct messages. So there's a huge difference between private and public schools, Consuelo said, and we need to make it better. In Argentina, we have a lot to do. Exactly. So I think we are basically very similar in terms of how language teaching, especially English language teaching, happens in our countries, right? Because we are South Americans, we're Latin Americans, and then we do have some of the same problems. But maybe Brazil is even worse than you might think. And the reason why I'm saying that is that, first of all, we are a plurilingual country, according to the records that we have. As many of the countries here in South America, we have lots and lots of native languages, you know, from the Native Americans who lived here before the Europeans arrived. We actually have around 230 languages being spoken, used on national territory, right? And I'm including lots of indigenous languages, of course, but also some languages from Europe. And we do have very large communities all over Brazil. So if you go to the south, you might find a very large, I mean, you will definitely find a very large German community. You're going to find a very large Italian community. In the city of São Paulo, for example, you find very, very big Asian communities. So South Korean, Japanese, Chinese, for example. But the paradox is that according to the British Council, only 5% of the population can speak English. And this, of course, is a little outdated. And then if you look at those who can speak English at, let's say, a functional, operational, independent level, so there are even fewer. If you think about it, perhaps less than 2% of the Brazilian population. So there's something there, something that is telling us that English language teaching is not working very well. And there can be lots of reasons. I'm sure you've thought about that. And one of the reasons is definitely lack of access and opportunities. So think about it. The other reason might be that maybe the types of approaches and methods that we're using are not working that well, right? This could be one of the reasons too, you know? Well, let's not get into correlation and causality here, but still there are a couple of things we might want to consider when we analyze the situation in Brazil. But then that brings me to the next, snapshot of our scenario. So if we think about our level of proficiency according to the English Proficiency Index, and you might have a lot of reservations here, towards their methodology. I myself have, of course, because of how they basically collect data and analyze everything. But still, it's a tool that we have. And if you look at that tool, I wonder, do you have any idea what the position of Brazil is? Or let's do this. Which country do you think has the best, let's say, level of proficiency, or the highest level of proficiency in South America. So let's talk about our region. So here in South America, looking at the map, which one would you say? And you can use the chat box there. I can see your messages. Exactly. Consuelo, yes, there you go. So number one is Argentina. So Argentina is number one in South America, but it's the 25th overall. And of course, we don't look at all of the countries, but we look at 100 countries. After Argentina, we have Chile. So congratulations. Chile is actually second in South America. So something you're doing right. You must be doing something right, you know. It might also be, of course, with income distribution, you know, the size of your population. Of course, there are many variables we should take into consideration here. But then Paraguay comes next, and then we have Bolivia, then we have Uruguay, and then we have Brazil. So Brazil is actually 53rd. So that's yellow. So you can see there in the map, and that means low proficiency. And you see that Brazil is actually quite close to the bottom, right? The second half. So after us, Brazilians, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, right? So what is that telling us? It's telling us that there's something wrong here. If you think about Brazil and how big Brazil is, and if you think about, you know, how much wealth we have, there's something wrong. And I think that that's true for many South American and, you know, overall Latin American countries. Either we're not focusing on English language teaching, we're not doing it right, we're not giving access to everyone, or there's something else. There are many other things that we should take into consideration. And why do I want to share that with you? Because that brings me to what's going on today. So today, more than ever, I mean, it started a couple of years ago, we're talking about how we can make sure that more and more students have access to English language. So that means we are trying to integrate within the schools a bilingual curriculum, so that you don't have to take kids from their schools to another place so that they can have English lessons, to a language center. Because, you know, up until very recently, I'd say, if you wanted to learn English in Brazil, you had to go to a language center, because, you know, if you were lucky enough to go to a very good private school, maybe you would have maybe two classes, two English lessons. They would be a 50-minute lesson each, twice a week. That's my case, certainly. So when I was studying as a student in high school, for example, I had sometimes there was a year that I had one lesson a week. The next year I had two lessons a week. They were 50-minute lessons, right? So that was me. I was in a private school. But of course, I learned English outside my school. I went to a language center. If you are in a public school, many times you didn't have English until the 6th grade. Even, you know, many years ago, you didn't have English at all, maybe just in high school. And you couldn't afford actually to, you know, go to a language center outside the school because they were really expensive. So now some of the recent developments of English teaching in Brazil are based on this debate that we have on bilingualism, right? Bilingual education. So we still don't have any specific legislation for bilingual education, except for Libras, that's Brazilian Sign Language, heritage languages, you know, like the indigenous languages that I told you about. There are over 200 languages there. Border schools, so a lot of schools that we have, very close to many Latin American countries, and South American countries actually, then they have some indigenous languages and Spanish, right? I mean, we do not share a border, Chile and Brazil, but, you know, we share a border with many other countries, almost all of them, except for Ecuador and Chile, if I'm not mistaken. So what does that mean? That until very recently, there were basically 3 groups providing bilingual education in Brazil. So international schools, bilingual schools, and schools with bilingual programs. And that's where I work, basically, schools with bilingual programs. We changed the name now. So I'm going to tell you about this document. But international schools, they adopt the curriculum of their country. So if it's an American school, they're going to look at the calendar and the curriculum of the United States. If it's a bilingual school, then you look at the classes, and there should be a minimum amount of hours for you to cover so that you can actually call yourself a bilingual school. But most schools, they have a bilingual program. So they have a couple of hours, could be 3 hours a week, more than regular schools, right? They're normally 2 or 1, 3 hours a week, 5 hours a week, or maybe even 10 hours a week of English. So here we're focusing on English as an additional language, right? And then, of course, because of all of that, if you look back 10 years ago, you can see that there was a huge boom of bilingual education solutions, right? So especially schools with bilingual programs, and what happened was a lot of schools adopted a bilingual program, and they started calling themselves bilingual schools, and they were not really bilingual schools because they didn't have enough hours, right? And then again, we had very important developments in the last couple of years. So the Brazilian Common Core, so the BNCC, right, says that, and not just actually, we had guidelines and laws about when English was supposed to be mandatory in our educational system. And it says that English becomes mandatory from the 6th grade on, okay? I was really lucky to be on a panel discussing this document that was drafted by the National Education Council that we have here in Brazil, Conselho Nacional da Educação, about bilingual education and the legislation around bilingual education. So I was there with great references here, Selma Moura, Raquel, Henry Correa, Rita Ladeia, for example. They're excellent, competent professionals. My good friend Rodolfo Machello and Maria Valesia, and we discussed this document. We actually talked about some of the things that were not there in the document that should be there. And now this document, which was not, it's like a bill. It hasn't been approved yet, right? But it will be probably, says that, well, what we will see in the next couple of years in Brazil is this. The first chapter, so the first chapter is really about the concepts, right? So what is the difference between a bilingual school? And if the school is not bilingual, then it should not be called a school with a bilingual program, but a school with an extended curriculum in the additional language, and international schools. And then chapter 2 is about the amount of hours. So for it to be a real bilingual school, it should be between 30 and 50% of classes, high school at least 20%. And then you have the teacher training requirements. So you need to have at least a bachelor's degree in pedagogy, education, modern languages, TESOL, B2 proficiency, and you need to take a 120-hour qualification course. And I'm very lucky to be teaching one of those courses. We are actually teaching our 6th group now. So very proud to be part of the first generation of people who are going to get that certificate, right? And then the curriculum. So the curriculum specifically talks about CLIL and project-based learning as approaches that should be used in bilingual schools, right? And then chapter 5 is about assessment. So we expect 6th graders to be A2 in bilingual schools, right? 9th graders to be at least B1, and by the end of high school, B2 minimum, right? And finally, chapter 6 is about how schools will make this transition. So once the legislation is approved by the end of 2021, and we're still waiting, everything should be taken into consideration. And then everyone working in bilingual education contexts will need to have the qualification course. They will need to have a degree in pedagogy education. They will have to have a B2 level and all of that, right? Okay, but then what about the approaches that were selected, and why are they so important? Well, first of all, because, and this is going to get a little controversial, because they use English not as an end in itself, but as a means or a medium, right? And then maybe, so if you look at language centers or how we have traditionally taught English in Brazil, we are really teaching English as an end in itself because we're preparing students for the Cambridge examinations or other examinations, and that's fine, really. But then in bilingual educations, don't we have to do something extra maybe? So that's what I'm going to ask you and challenge here. And it's really about interdisciplinarity, because you use English to learn something else, right? You use English to work on projects. You use English to learn science, maths, or history, right? And so it's not really just about content. I saw that Simon was talking about the C's of CLIL and everything, and it's really about developing skills, competencies, and then the C's, culture, communication, cognition, right? So this is very important, because traditionally we have been teaching English as a very content-driven sort of subject, pretty much like we've been teaching history in Brazil. You just have to memorize a bunch of things, vocabulary and grammar, and that's it. There was no focus on skills, unless, of course, you would go to a language center. And many language centers, they focused on approaches or methods that have been used many times in different contexts, and they're not exactly up to date, let's say, right? And then what about the book? And that's really the main message of my session, right? So given this scenario, so what do we do with the book? And then I asked John Hughes, who's an amazing author, if I could use his picture, our picture together. I was in London watching one of his sessions on materials writing, and he said, no problem, you can use it. It just emphasizes how tall you are when compared to me, the difference in our height, right? But he said I could use the photo. And I remember that he basically said this, and this is something that I got from his blog, right? I try to set the record straight that when any author writes a course book, they don't assume that a teacher will do everything on the page, but instead that teachers will adapt the material work so it works for them and their students. This might mean missing certain exercises. That's very important out, asking extra questions about the photos, or maybe flipping a reading task so you read it before a lesson and then discuss it in class. Now, I would love to know your opinion about this, right? Do you need to use all of the book and consider the bilingual education context? Does it even work? If we are supposed to adopt CLIL and PBL, how can we use conventional English books and make them work in our context, right? And this is a legitimate question, I think, because this is something that has been on my mind for a very long time now, working with bilingual program schools, right? Or schools with an extended curriculum in English. If we are to adapt to the new legislation that is coming out very soon, hopefully, what is to happen of what we normally do in bilingual education contexts? Does it even make sense? Yeah. Right? So this is a question that I'm asking you. I want you to reflect on that. And then John says, we normally make the book for 3 types of teacher. The first teacher is maybe a novice teacher. They don't have a lot of experience. And then the book becomes a real guide that they have to follow everything. And that's great because, everything has been curated and revised by a group of amazing professionals. And then they have lots and lots of options to use. And then they normally just follow the sequence of the book, right? So that's teacher number 1. Teacher number 2, they have more experience and they have access to more resources, for example. But since they have more experience and more resources, they adapt more things in the book according to their reality, because we know that classes are organic, that things happen. Sometimes you have to improvise, right? And then you have teacher number 3. And teacher number 3 is the kind of teacher that doesn't even need the book that much. They need the book to inform basically the lesson and the aims of the lesson. Maybe this lesson is about present continuous, and then, the teacher knows how to do present continuous with your students, even without the book. But then the book is a very important guide that tells you the sequence that you have to follow. That's why you have the scope and sequence, the syllabus, right? Anyway, I'm going to help you reflect on this, but we should be maybe focusing on getting teachers to level 3, according to what John Hughes says, rather than really focusing on the book that much, maybe. I don't know what your opinion about this is, but so think about it and then we can talk later. And then, so think about this. The books that we have today for bilingual education and are the books that we normally use from all the amazing big publishers, Cambridge included. I've used so many Cambridge books, Oxford books, National Geographic books, Macmillan books. They're excellent material, really. But they were made for international audiences. So they are very general. They have lots of generic stuff sometimes, and they kind of disregard local contexts. So if you think about working with CLIL and PBL, sure, you have to know about international scenarios, of course, but then bilingual education traditionally in where it started. So if you look at Canada, for example, and even Europe, so they really focus on local realities as well. And this is something that we don't get so much from international books, right? So yeah, of course, you have a lesson that is about people who live, I don't know, near the Andes Mountains in South America, for example, but that's one lesson or one unit or something like that. So what do we have to do to make sure that the book reflects the reality of people studying, right? And they are EFL oriented, and EFL is English as a foreign language, right? They are not even ESL oriented because normally they are divided into British and American versions, right? So of course, some of the listenings have been recorded by people from different countries, but we understand that in bilingual contexts, I think we have to change our approach because we don't have this monoglossic view of bilingualism that the languages are separated, but heteroglossic view. And in that case, I think we have to probably focus more on an ELF or ELF, English as a lingua franca approach, right? So, of course, there are things we can do with the books that we have, and that's what I'm asking you, right? And somebody mentioned that English is a language, not a subject, exactly. So it needs to be taught in a different way, right? And then many books that we have access to, they are based on the communicative language teaching approach, right? And normally very task-based. So you have the PPP framework. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. So, you have a pre-reading, you have the while reading, and the after post-reading. And of course, you have, very controlled practice, and less controlled practice, and freer practice. And then you have production, and then you have a grammar box, and then you have critical thinking, and you have all of that. This is wonderful. I've taught many years of my life using books like that in a language center. When I get to a school where there are 40 kids, and they actually have to revise some mathematical concepts, for example, how do we adapt this type of material so that we can actually do what the legislation in Brazil is asking for, right? So this is a huge challenge. And then they focus more on the linguistic development. And of course they should, because they were designed for language centers. But then again, going back to bilingual education, does it work if we just use those books? Do we have to add something? Do we have to remove something? So what is it that we have to do to make sure that we're actually teaching according to the demands of bilingual education? So again, many of those books don't fit in with the PBL and CLIL requirements. And now we do have a major, big question. What then? So what should we do, So if we look at the recent history here in Brazil and we see this huge movement toward bilingual education, and lots of schools are actually adopting this, and then we will actually have legislation about this, and maybe in the near future, more schools will be able to call themselves bilingual. Where does that leave us with the book, right? Exactly, Lillian. Lillian mentioned something very important. So now we have to think of books being written for specific contexts. And I think publishers, they have to be aware of that, And that's, so how do you make a book that is generic enough for people from different countries to adopt, but is this specific enough for the context of certain countries working with bilingual education? Can you even do that? And we must ask those questions, right? So what did we do? I mean, I work with Edify, and we were trying to adapt. We do have, there's a publisher, a publisher that we use, Learning Factory, with great books. They were more adapted for the Brazilian reality, but that was not enough. So I had to write, and I was the author of, an ebook and a guide to help adapt, because for a lot of school managers, first of all, they don't understand what CLIL is, how the books are supposed to be used. And then I wrote an ebook, CLIL for school managers, basically. And then we had a very nice international experience between Brazil and Mexico. And we got some students from a school that we had in the South, plus a school in Guadalajara, Mexico. And they worked with project-based learning. But they were using their materials, their book. Their book was provided by ACT GAC. So I'm sure many of you have heard of ACT, right? And GAC is the Global Assessment Certificate. They get credits to go to universities abroad. But then the book itself didn't really talk about PBL. So we needed to look at the units and the lessons, and we needed to make something extra, and then I designed this PBL guide for them. And then we had a very successful international PBL experience, which was great. But again, the books that they had, and they're very different books. The Brazilian and Mexican students, they had CLIL books, not adapted for PBL, and we wanted them to work with PBL. And the other books that we had, they were sort of PBL, but then the school managers didn't know how to use them, or they couldn't understand how to use them. And that brings me to the lessons learned. So I can, finish my remarks, and then you can start asking me questions. And so the lessons learned here, really, from first the Brazil-Mexico connection work that we did, is at the high school level, right? They were working with CLIL, that the material was CLIL, but we wanted them to work with PBL. The book served as a catalyst, because the book had a lot of interesting units that could be aligned with some of the guidelines of PBL. So if you look at PBL, student voice and choice, and there's a driving question, there's a publicly presented product, right? Lots of feedback, adjustments, and things like that. So we could actually align many of the units with the PBL requirements. And it was truly international, and it worked well. And we are very proud to say that it did work, but we had to create something extra. We had to make this, guideline to help them use the book that they had. So they used the entire book. They really focused on the units of the book, but they just did it together with international peers working on a project, right? So that's one way you can use the book. The other way is we actually have, very good books also. I mean, we won 2 awards now. I mean, we haven't won the last one. Maybe we will this year, Elton's award, right? But we did win with Magic Minds last year for course innovation. And this book is really all about projects, working with projects, and you have lots and lots of project ideas at the end of each unit. But then we had remote classes. How do you use that physical book with the students? A lot of those students are very young learners. So how do you actually use the book, And then we had some other projects that are now running for this award. And then we don't know if we're going to win, hopefully. But still, how do you use that in remote classes, in concurrent classes? And then we learned that even if you do have the physical book, but the physical book doesn't have interactive platforms, and we do have, but it has to be better, and I think I'm speaking for basically all books when I say that. It has to be much better in some regards, because then some students will only use the books online nowadays because of the pandemic. So that made us think about how we could actually work with that. And again, what really changed was the pandemic. The pandemic came, and the pandemic made us look at what we had in a different way, right? So we we understood from early on when the pandemic hit us that a lot of the materials that we had, the books that we had, would have to go through major adaptations. And we've always known that in a way. I mean, they were being adapted as we were using them. But then there is a mindset here in Brazil and maybe in the whole of South America and Latin America that the book is the comment, right? Sorry, not the comment, the method. The book is the method. And if the book is the method and you skip activity 1A, parents are going to complain because they bought the book, right? Or if you're teaching adult learners, and since we're talking about bilingual education, we're really focusing on kids and teenagers. They get home and then their parents look at their book and they see that, uh-oh, this wasn't done. So I bought the book. Why aren't they using the book? So we do have to change the mindset because sometimes it's not evident for parents how the teachers use their book. And since we are in this changing world, especially with the pandemic, with new educational technologies, digital and online technologies, and we only get stuck with the book, right? How much time do we have left to explore other things? And then in bilingual education contexts, how do you actually cover the CLIL and PBL requirements? I mean, and I'm speaking here from the legislation that is coming out here in Brazil. So we have to ask those questions, right? And then just coming to my concluding remarks. So what do we do then, right? Go mad. I'm telling you, go mad. I mean, go mad means I wrote a blog post about this and I mentioned John Hughes' quote that I showed you earlier, the three levels of teachers, you know, the ones who are going to really get stuck with the book and do everything because maybe they don't have the resources or maybe they don't have the experience. And then the ones who are more flexible and the ones who just need the book as a reference. What do I have to do today? They know what to do. And I call that the maintain, alter, and discard principle, right? Go mad with the books. Because I think really the idea is that the book is not the method, but it's incredibly useful. I mean, I'm not saying that books have become obsolete. On the contrary, I'd say, you know, so without the books, imagine the work and the effort really that, you know, as a novice teacher, even as an experienced teacher, you wouldn't know really what resources to use if you didn't have the book. And we have to make sure that people understand that. But the book gives you ideas to work with something else many times, you know. You have an activity in the book that reminds you of a YouTube video or, you know, a digital platform, a game. Why not use them, especially today? Yeah.
10 minutes to finish. So
okay,
you should give some room for questions.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. So, but if the book is incredibly useful and we don't have to really use everything that the book offers, and many of those books are not really adapted for the bilingual education context. So what is it that we could do, right? And one of the things that I really want to bring your attention to again is that there aren't many options out there, you know? I mean, nowadays, like Lillian mentioned, we are adapting, we're making books for the bilingual, for the Brazilian context. I'm sure that other countries are doing the same. So I urge the publishers here to think about this movement, right? So if we are basically heading towards, you know, more and more bilingual education, bilingual schools. So what is it that we are looking for? How can big publishers help us do that? You know, because we will need big publishers to address CLIL and PBL more and more, and not really EFL and the communicative approach and task-based and PPP and all of that, right? Also, digital online tech is here to stay. So nowadays, I mean, for those who have the privilege, of course, we understand that public school kids, they don't have the privilege many times. But for those who do, there has to be some sort of digital platform that makes things easier. And I know that we do have them. So maybe, how about maybe a crazy idea here? We have a physical book that is still based on PPP and EFL and CLT and all of that. And then we do have a digital platform that focuses more on how can you make that CLIL? How can you make that PBL? Here's a crazy idea, huh? You know, because then of course, this will require lots of people to work on it. I know that, but then you can help those people looking for a solution for the new problems that we have today. And then change of mindset. So one of the reasons why we don't change things maybe is because the schools don't understand, and the parents, especially the parents, don't understand that even though the book is still one of the central pillars of our teaching, it's not the only resource, right? And then we don't have to follow the book as a literary book that you have to read every word of every page to understand what's going on. So it's more like a magazine if you think about it, right? That you have a bunch of options that you can read, and then those options are going to help you achieve a goal. And then this is going to be put together by your teacher, but also you have a lot of voice and choice as you go along. And teacher education. So maybe what we should be talking more and more about is how do we get those teachers from level 1, according to John Hughes, to level 3, that they feel much more confident, they know how to use the resources that they have, you know, they can actually adapt things as they go. So they get the book, they look at what the book is asking them to do, the scope and sequence, the syllabus, but then they know how to adapt. They know how to find other resources to make sure that that becomes more CLIL, that becomes more PBL, right? And again, this is the big challenge, because how do you do that if only 5% or maybe let's say 10% of the Brazilian population can speak English at some level? And how do you get the professionals you need to work in the bilingual education context today? So there is a huge challenge, and hopefully you will have some questions so that I can answer them, and then we can talk together, try to think of a couple of solutions. But that's it, everyone. Thank you very much. If you want to contact me, please follow EDC Rocks on Instagram, or you can access my website where you can find my blog, edcrocks.com. And I'm sure that you will find something interesting to read there. And hopefully you can connect with me. You can send me an email through my blog, and then I will get back to you as soon as possible. And who knows, maybe we can find a solution together. That's why I'm here today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andre, and thank you for sharing not only from your professional experience, but from your country reality as well. And we have a lot of Brazilians interacting in the chat, you know, so this has become like the Brazilian corner, the Brazilian moment, which, and you know what, we feel really happy about this, because this is a Latin or Latin American experience we want to go through, and it's really enriching for the Chilean context to learn about your reality. There are some questions here. Probably first, trying to answer some of the more logistical type of questions. People asking about the program, what happened before, what's happening next. Please remember, you will be able to check on our YouTube channels. After the sessions are over, this material will be available, and we will probably let you know tomorrow when the video recordings will be available on YouTube. All right, so hopefully people can get connected there. There's a question here from Isabella Campos.
Okay.
How to ensure proficiency will happen if content is consuming part of the time that was once dedicated to learning the language?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I read something in El País from Spain, and a couple of weeks ago, somebody posted that on LinkedIn, and some of the teachers, they basically said that students who go through a bilingual type of education are not going to be as proficient as, you know. So if you think about people who go to a language center, we have a lot of language centers that are somehow attached to embassies, to countries, binational centers all over the world. We certainly have many in Brazil, in Latin America. And because of their requirements and because of how proficient and well-trained their teachers are, apparently the students are going to have higher levels of proficiency. And those courses are based on the common European framework of reference, right? But the thing is, do all students want to do the CPE? Aren't there probably many more students who just want to be functional at the language, want to be operational, independent, and they don't want to have a certificate. They just want to communicate, for example. And aren't there students who probably drop out because when they go to the language center, they realize that's not for me. It's not, I don't want that. I'm I don't know, I'm a marine biologist. And then I started at the A1 level, and then I'm just learning conversational skills and everything and vocabulary. And after a couple of, maybe 2 years even, I realized that, you know, I just wanted to be functional at a conference and talk about my job. And I've never seen even a word about what I do, you know? So then again, we have to look at that. And what about those people who want to be functional in maths? Because maybe that's what they want to do. Maybe they will be going to an international maths Olympiad, for example, and they don't want to have a certificate. And I think if you look in retrospect, I think those people, they actually form the majority. So again, we are using our EFL mindset to look at bilingual education. And I think those things, we have to be careful because they are not exactly the same. So if maybe you lose more in proficiency, but then you become more functional in specific areas because that's what you want, you know?
Okay, thank you. There are several questions coming up on PBL. Several questions on PBL. And I'm trying to make like a synthesis of several of these questions. But in general terms, this is an interesting question. I have a question. This is Lisa Miller. I have a question about PBL in a bilingual elementary school setting. I would love to know at what age it works without front loading all of the vocabulary and concepts for them in the second language.
Yeah, that's a hard question, Lisa. I'm not sure I can give you a specific answer there because, you know, we normally think that students require a certain level of language to work with PBL, which of course, you know, makes sense. But I think in a bilingual context where students share their mother tongue, a lot of the work can be done in L1. And that's something that we cannot think because again, we are wearing our EFL hats, you know, we're looking at bilingual education as EFL teachers. So we have the concepts of translanguaging, for example, and code switching. So if you want students to work on a project and they are very young learners, but they can communicate in their own language, and throughout the process, they learn the specific vocabulary to work on the project and the skills and the chunks. So it does work, you know, it can work really well, actually. But that does not work if you're teaching in a language center using the communicative language teaching approach, in which many times L1 is stigmatized. So, you know, it's forbidden or, you know, reduced to a minimum. And then it doesn't really work that well. I have myself worked with PBL on many occasions. I've started as you know, a teacher, let's say, who became passionate about PBL 5 or 6 years ago. And I used them in an EFL context where students, they had very lower levels of language. And I remember that most of the work that they had to do together took place outside of my classroom because I was using the communicative language teaching approach. But again, you know, they could connect with each other. 10-year-old students, you know, they got together, and I reserved a couple of minutes at the end of my lesson for them to work on the project, but they could use Portuguese when they had to, because, you know, otherwise the project wouldn't happen. You know, that's really the question, isn't it? If we want the project to happen, they have to have the tools to work on the project. Otherwise, it won't work.
Great, great. Listen, this is a good one and a hard one to answer too. Uh,
Yes.
Now, considering the global context, we
Yep.
already had a presenter talk about think global but act locally. That's Jorgelina
Yes.
Carlasari posed before earlier. Now we have
Excellent.
Javiera Aliaga asking this. What do you think, Andre, about prioritizing learning English as a second language and not a native language? Native to each
Yes.
country. Okay.
Yes.
And please bear in mind that tomorrow, and this is for the audience and for Andre, tomorrow we're finishing with a presentation in Spanish with what we call in Chile educadora tradicional, a traditional teacher of
Yep.
Mapudungun. She will be
Yep.
telling us and sharing about the experience of Mapudungun Spanish in Chile. Andre.
Yes. So yes, I think we have to change the focus, but not to ESL, because they are not going to be in touch with the English language so much outside their classroom here in Brazil. Of course, nowadays with the globalized world and Netflix and songs and everything, they are constantly listening to English, sometimes even playing games in English. But I think we can embrace the idea of English as a lingua franca more and more, because then we are not looking at a golden standard of a native speaker, and that's very important. And again, I urge the publishers to include more non-native speakers in their listening activities, and not people are not going just to the UK and to the USA anymore. There are more than 54 countries, I think, where English is the official language. And if we embrace English as a lingua franca, then we are going to focus much more on intelligibility rather than accent, really, right? And then this is a major change, because I think that if you ask anybody on the streets in Brazil, perhaps even in Chile, they probably have an answer. They will say, I want to learn British English, right? So if they go to the UK, and I've lived there for my master's course, right? Which British English do you want? How many are there? I lived in Bristol. They don't talk like people from Kent, for example, or Liverpool or Manchester, So it's different. And again, we have this illusion that there is an ideal native that we have to look up to, when that's actually not true. So I think English as a lingua franca helps us change the focus and really try to be understood, and communicate well with as many people as possible. Apparently, native speakers from certain countries are, according to research, that's not me saying, the worst communicators in the world. So maybe we should take advantage that non-native speakers, they at least try to be more intelligible. And that's a good thing, I think we're just trying to get what one another is saying, right?
Great. And I think we have time for one more question, if you make it to the point.
Yes.
How to make sure students are protagonists in PBL and still
Yes.
cover the curriculum?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions, Joaquin. So I can give you an example of this Brazil-Mexico connection. We had milestones, and we had weekly progress check activities, for example, that they looked at, and this is very interesting, because they look at the scope and sequence of their entire book, and they have to create a project that works, because PBL is not really working with one project once. It's actually permeating the whole curriculum for a longer time, and then there are several steps. And I think that if you use a couple of strategies like strategic planning, for example, that you set up dates, deadlines, checks, milestones that they have to share things. And you, as a teacher, you're really the supervisor there. You're the moderator. You're just, okay, what did you do this week? So they are the protagonists, but you have to see what they are doing. You make their learning visible, to quote John Hattie here. Make sure that they're using portfolios. Make sure that they have digital platforms that you can just hop in and see if they're working, like Padlet or Google Classroom or Jamboard or whatever you have, Google Slides, right? So that you see that the work is being done, you're moderating, you're guiding them, but you're not doing the work for them. But then again, there is not just peer pressure because they're working together, but you you have some pressure on them as well to get things done. If you just wait for things to be done and then you check at the end of the semester to see if they did the project, chances are they won't have done the project. So you have to be really following them up close to make sure that things are working.
Fantastic. That's really, really good and to the point. We want to thank André Hedlund from Brazil once again. André is an expert in bilingual education. He is a senior mentor in different programs in Brazil. We mentioned them at the beginning. It would be long to say that again.
Yes.
André, well, we invite you to stay with us. We still have some time to go. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to remind our audience that we're having in 3 more minutes, we'll be joining the breakout rooms. In one room, we will have Cambridge University Press presenting about the international curriculum. And then in the other breakout room, we'll have Neuroeducas, Francisca Kelly, presenting about Diploma in Teaching English to Young Learners 2022. Okay, so stay with us. Quick reminder, start using the filter we have on the Instagram account, so that you can say hi through Instagram. And what else should I say? And after we come back from the breakout rooms, we'll have a wonderful panel meeting to talk about successful experiences in early bilingualism. So I leave you here. And André, once again, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the next sessions.
Thank you.